Good morning, friends, or good afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this. We've had some technical difficulties the past 2 weeks, so I'm re-recording this message that I delivered on Sunday morning. I think we've got everything sorted out. So this Sunday, hopefully, you will be watching a live message and some live worship music. So let's look forward to that together. But this morning, I want to share with you a bit about the parable of the weeds and the fishing net. So let's talk about weeds and bad fish. These parables are found in Matthew chapter 13. Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like an owner planting wheat in his field. And at night an enemy came along and planted weeds, and both the wheat and the weeds grew in the field. The workers asked the owner if they should pull the weeds out, and the owner said no, because if you pull the weeds out, you may uproot the wheat along with the weeds. So let both of them grow together until harvest. And at that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds, tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring them into my barn." Jesus continued. He said again, "The kingdom of heaven is like a fishing net that was thrown into the water and caught every kind of fish. And when the net was full, they dragged it up onto the shore, sat down and sorted the good fish into crates, but threw the bad ones away. And that's the way it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous." Well, when I was a kid, I used to fish a lot. I grew up in a small town. There wasn't much else to do. And we caught all kinds of fish, bass and trout and carp. We used to catch other river creatures like crayfish and salamanders and water snakes and turtles. I remember one time catching a salmon in the Maitland River. They were swimming upstream to spawn. And I was 10 years old, and I caught this salmon. It was 10 pounds and over 30 inches long, the absolute highlight of my childhood fishing career. Now, the most shocking moment of my childhood fishing career happened when I was 7 or 8 years old. We were fishing under a bridge, and one of the kids that I was fishing with, he caught a lamprey eel. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these things, but, well, technically, lamprey are not eels. They're actually prehistoric creatures right out of a horror movie. It looked like an alien creature. It had this silvery, whitish skin, and it was long and skinny like an eel or a snake, and it had this mouth that it didn't have jaws. It was just this open, gaping circle of teeth. I was horrified. I couldn't believe such monstrous things lived in the river where we went swimming. But the reality is there are all kinds of fish and sea creatures living in the lakes and rivers of Ontario where we live. And Jesus is saying the same is true in the kingdom of God. There are lots of bass and trout and pickerel, but there are also lamprey and eels. You know, it's really a strange picture that Jesus paints here to describe the kingdom of God, saying it's a net full of good fish and bad fish. What does Jesus mean? Well, he goes on to explain what he means. He says the kingdom of God gathers all kinds of people. And it has both wheat and weeds, good fish and bad fish. Jesus also explains that the harvesting and the separation of the wheat and the weeds and the sorting of the good fish and bad fish will happen at the harvest time, which happens at the end of the age. And the harvesters, the sorters, are not human beings, not you and I. The ones who will separate the wheat from the weeds and the good fish from the bad fish are God's angels. Well, what is Jesus teaching us here that applies to our lives today? Well, I think a great deal. First, Jesus is saying there will be a great judgment, a great reckoning. In God's time, God will sort everything and everyone out. Now, there's a lot of things in the world that need to be sorted out. There are a lot of wrongs that need to be made right. There's injustice and war and violence and oppression. When you look around, it seems the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. The righteous suffer while the wicked prosper. And This is nothing new. This was actually the experience of most people in the Bible, in their time and culture. This reality is as old as time itself. And what Jesus is saying here is there will be justice. Things will get sorted out. You can count on that. But it probably won't happen in your lifetime. You're going to have to trust God to make things right in the end. Now, this final judgment, this great reckoning that Jesus is talking about, does this mean that good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell? That believers go to heaven and unbelievers go to hell? The righteous go to heaven, the unrighteous go to hell? Well, when you start thinking this way, you are trying to sort people out. And Jesus is telling us here that that's not your job. That's the job of God and God's angels at the end of the age. You know, I think this is the second major point of Jesus' teaching here, that God will sort it all out. You don't have to. You can't. So don't even try. Jesus is inviting us to think differently about who is in and who is out. And by differently, I mean Jesus is inviting us not to think about it at all. Our job is to welcome everyone in the kingdom of God, because Jesus is saying everyone belongs. And if you go around trying to sort people out, if you try to separate the wheat from the weeds, Jesus says you will cause harm. That means we will have to coexist with some bad fish and some bad weeds in the kingdom of God. However, the real point is we can't think that way. Because when we think that way, we are starting to sort out who is a weed and who is wheat, who the bad fish are and who the good fish are. And it's simply above your pay grade to understand how this sorting out process works. Later on, Jesus tells another parable about this great judgment day, this great reckoning. It's the parable of the sheep and the goats. And one of the interesting things in this parable is that the sheep were surprised they were sheep. And some of the goats, well, they were surprised too because they thought they were sheep. There will be some surprises at the great reckoning. A lot of the people we think are bad fish, well, they might turn out to be good fish. And some of us who assume we are good fish, well, we might not be as good as we thought. Ultimately, Jesus is challenging us with a question here. And the question is this: are you trying to sort people out? Do you separate people into the good fish category and into the bad fish category? And the answer is, of course you do. We all do this to some degree. So let me ask you a very pointed question. Who is a bad fish in our church? Who is a weed? And you're probably thinking, that's a terrible question to ask. What a preposterous notion. There are no bad fish in our church. I would never think that way. Good for you. And you're right. That's not a great question. Not very appropriate at all. But I bet you have thought that way about some people, about some Christians. So let's broaden it a bit. Maybe you haven't thought that way about anyone in our church, but which Christians have you labeled in your mind as bad fish, as weeds? Which churches, which denominations, which group of Christians? There are a lot of different groups, you know, from ultra-conservative to ultra-liberal, and many different groups in between. And which groups of Christians, in your mind, are the good fish? And which ones are the bad fish? Have you ever thought, oh, those Christians, they're not real Christians. They're not genuine Christians. They don't actually follow the way of Jesus. Let me ask you another question. And if you're like me, you have thought that. I think we've all had those thoughts. But let me ask you another question. What is your line? Where do you draw the line? What makes someone a good fish and someone a bad fish? Is it based on people's behavior? Well, how much selfish or sinful behavior is too much? Or maybe it's based on people's beliefs. Okay, well, how much unorthodox is too unorthodox with regards to our beliefs? Or maybe your line is based on how people express their faith. Again, what faith expressions make you a good fish and what faith expressions make you a bad fish? Where do you draw the line of who is in and who is out? Well, in my 20s, I came across a poem by a poet named Edwin Markham, and this poem has become central to my faith and spirituality. I try to live this out, not always successfully, but it's become very important to me and how I approach other people, especially in regards to the kingdom of God. Here is the poem. He drew a circle that shut me out. He called me a rebel, a heretic, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. I love that. You see, I believe what Jesus is teaching here about the kingdom of God is that it's always drawing a bigger circle to include more and more people, even the bad fish, even the weeds. Now, religion draws lines that exclude others. But the kingdom of God, Jesus says, is drawing circles that draw them back in. Now you may be wondering, wait a second, Troy, is it really realistic to include everyone and let God sort it all out? Shouldn't we do some sorting out? Don't we need to draw some lines in the sand? Well, it's a good question, and here's where I've landed. I think it's clear Jesus is teaching us that the general rule of thumb in the kingdom of God is to include all people and let God sort it out in the end. However, when we look at all of Jesus' teachings, we see there are exceptions to the rule. Like, for example, when he says that someone who harms children, it would be better if a giant stone were tied to their necks and they were thrown into the sea. That's pretty harsh. It seems like Jesus is drawing some kind of line there. But what is also clear in Jesus' teachings is those are exceptions to the rule. The rule of thumb in the kingdom of God is all people are included. Welcome. They all belong, and God will sort it out in the end. There are exceptions, but when those exceptions become the norm, what that means is we've changed the rule. So if you are routinely sorting people out, deciding who needs to be called out or canceled or shunned on a daily or even weekly basis, then you're not living out this principle of Jesus with regards to the kingdom of God. What that means is sorting people out has become the rule for your life instead of being the exception to the rule. So maybe we need a quota system. You know, like, okay, Troy, you sorted someone out last week. You're done for the month. No more sorting out people for you. I think at the very least, it should feel uncomfortable for us to sort other people out. It should require prayerful reflection and soul-searching consultation with the Spirit of God. It should make us ask some pretty deep questions. Like, what teaching of Jesus is requiring me to sort this person out? And is this other teaching of Jesus or John or Paul, is it more important in this situation than Jesus' teachings about non-judgment and about including all people and letting God sort it out in the end? Some other important questions would be, do I still feel love for this person that I'm sorting out? Do I feel genuine compassion for them? Am I curious about why they think the way they think, believe the way they believe, behave the way they behave? Betty Priest, the author of The Space Between Us, she suggests this question. I think it's a great question. Instead of asking what's wrong with this person, ask what happened to this person. It's a better question. It's a question that gets to the heart of relationships in the kingdom of God, in my mind. The truth is, everyone belongs in the kingdom of God. That's what Jesus is teaching us. We're all in this garden together, and that means there's going to be weeds. We're all in this net together, and there's going to be some bad fish. The general rule of thumb, the principle Jesus is teaching us is don't go pulling weeds up. Don't go sorting out the other fish in the net with us. That's God's job. Now, this obviously doesn't mean we don't need healthy boundaries with people. We absolutely do. Jesus had good boundaries. He modeled good boundaries, and he taught us to have good boundaries. We have to take all of Jesus' teachings into context. For example, Jesus says don't judge, but Jesus does teach us to be discerning. Now, what's the difference? Well, here's an oversimplified version, but it's been helpful for me. Judgment is about the other person. Discernment is about me and my response to the other person. So judgment is about defining another person, defining who they are. Discernment is about determining who I need to be in relationship to that person. It's determining how I need to behave in relationship to that person. I'll give you an example. Judgment would be condemning someone, undermining someone, shaming them, condemning them, labeling them because they struggle with addictions, for example, like alcohol. Discernment, on the other hand, would be choosing not to serve wine when I invite that person over to my house for supper. Discernment is about me and my response and my behavior in relationship to that person, whereas judgment focuses on the other person and defining who they are. Now, without question, there are times to hold people accountable, to stand up to people, to call them out, like when they cause harm to others, for example. But then we have to define the word harm. Is causing offense harm? Are microaggressions harm? That's another message. I don't have time to get into that. But what I think is clear here is Jesus is discouraging us from sorting other people out. In general, it's not our job. But more than that, Jesus is encouraging us that God will sort everyone and everything out in the end. I think Jesus is acknowledging our reality here. He's empathizing with us. He's saying, I know it seems like a lot of people in your life and in the world and in government are bad fish. I think Jesus is saying, I feel you. I feel your pain. I see that the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper. I see that the rich seem to be getting richer and the poor get poorer. The powerful thrive and the powerless die. Jesus is saying, you're not wrong. You're not out of your mind for thinking this way. I see it. But he's also saying this, there will be justice in the end. Everyone and everything will be sorted out. So trust God. You can trust God. This is in part what I think it means to live by faith. Trusting God to sort it all out in the end. So I encourage you, brothers and sisters, let us live by faith. Let us love. Let us include. And let's trust God to sort it all out in the end.